Hi, this is Jean, and I am going to share with you my presentation called Knowledge is for Everybody, the Important Contributions of a Much-Maligned 95-Year-Old Man. I have been reading about E.D. Hirsch and his work for years, and I finally decided to read through all of the books that he wrote about education and knowledge building. I wrote this presentation a few weeks ago, but I am still kind of recovering from pneumonia, so I apologize for my voice. I decided I finally needed to just record it. I don't know if I'll ever get my voice back. So these are the E.D. Hirsch books that I have read cover to cover. So his friends call him Don. He goes by E.D. Hirsch, and he has written several books about knowledge and American education. If you do not know who I am a Title I reading teacher in an elementary school in South Dakota, and I have a dyslexia certificate from the University of Florida. I was one of several teachers who started South Dakota's Science of Reading Facebook group, and I've recorded videos about similar topics before, most notably my Science of Reading videos, parts 1 and 2. I decided to share this information with you because I had read so much and absorbing this information and want you to be able to have an overview of it without having to read 11 books. And excuse me, I think it's very important. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on the topic after I present this information to you that I learned from reading E.D. Hirsch. A lot of stuff to think about as we go through here. One of the reasons that I wanted to record this as well is because he is somebody who is just so maligned and hated and for the wrong reasons, not because people are reading something that he wrote and then critiquing it, but because he is just written off as being a conservative who is trying to indoctrinate kids. And that's not true. Now, again, knowledge is for everybody. It's for conservatives and for progressives. And he is somebody who wants everybody in this nation to have the knowledge that is held by those who have power. He wants that knowledge to be accessible to everybody. And he had been doing some work in colleges in Virginia, and he visited a community college that was attended by mostly African-American students, and he found out that they had not been taught about the Civil War, including events that happened right there in their backyard in Virginia. And he decided to, at that point, really focus on knowledge building and making sure that everybody gets access to our shared cultural knowledge. Excuse me. As I was reading his books and thinking about this topic, I kept thinking about this quote that he had in one of his books from Samuel Johnson. There is no matter what children should learn first, any more than what leg you should put into your breeches first. Sir, you may stand disputing which is best to put in first, but in the meantime, your backside is bare. Sire, while you stand considering which of two things you should teach your child first, another boy has learned of both. This really stood out to me because I've worked with a variety of children in many different situations, urban, rural, lower, higher socioeconomic status. I now have 3 school-age children of my own, and I've definitely seen that some children have access to a lot of information and knowledge that other kids do not have access to. And also because we are having so many debates right now about what should be taught, that many teachers are afraid to teach anything that builds any kind of knowledge, which is pretty scary. So there's some misconceptions and criticisms about E.D. Hirsch. Misconceptions. E.D. Hirsch is a conservative who wants to indoctrinate children into conservative ideology, or he wants to prescribe what Americans should know. Okay, first of all, he, as far as him being a conservative, he actually identifies himself as a progressive, and he says basically a socialist. He said in the past he would be known now as more of a classical liberal, and some I think what has led to this confusion, there's three things that happen. One, he does talk about being an educational conservative, that in order to be a social progressive, you need to be an educational conservative. So he does use that word. Another thing is that when he published his book, a very prominent conservative author also published a similar book, and I think he got lumped in there. And then the third thing is that when he published cultural literacy in the 1980s, a very prominent conservative endorsed it. So I think that that is where that misconception came from. Now, the problem that I see then, whether, whatever your political ideology is that people who are progressive in their political ideology are just writing him off and say he's a conservative. He's trying to make kids conservative, and that's not what he was trying to do, or that he is trying to do with his organization. And as far as that he wants to prescribe what Americans should know, so he did make a list in the 1980s, and that list has been updated since then several times. He would say that he doesn't care what the knowledge is. It just needs to be whatever is the knowledge, whatever is known by the most powerful members of a culture, that everybody should have access to that very same knowledge. Now, there is a movement, you may or may not be aware of, classical education. Now, they are more prescriptive as far as what they want kids to learn. So he is not a classical educator. He does not insist that kids learn the Western tradition, Greek. Well, that's part of what he's teaching, but not the focus on the greatness of the Western tradition and Greek and Latin, and the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So those kinds of things, he often gets Hirsch often gets an honorable mention by the classical education folks, but he is not them. And the difference is that he is wanting to be descriptive. Like, okay, what do the most powerful people know? That's what that's what other people should know. That's what everybody should have access to. And the classical education people would be more prescriptive. Another misconception, that it was only folks from one political party who worked on the cultural literacy list and on the CKLA curriculum. And that's not true. There were people from various walks of life and belief systems that were a part of this. So it was originally put together late 80s or early 90s. So when you look back at the older list, there are things that stand out as maybe not being as important, and things that are omitted. And that list has been updated several times since then by groups of people that are from various backgrounds. Another misconception, that E.D. Hirsch is responsible for the Common Core state standards. Before the Common Core comes out, as you're reading through these books, you see that he's very excited about Common Core, having a common core. But what he's talking about is a common core of knowledge, like about, history, geography, science, those kinds of things, that is systematically taught to kids in school. He's not talking about what ended up being the Common Core state standards, and he was especially disappointed, and you can read those in the later books, read his thoughts on that the Common Core standards for language arts ended up being so process-based instead of content-based. Another misconception is that knowledge is racist, that by teaching kids things that happened, that is racist. And especially that teaching kids that the things that happen in Europe would be racist against folks who have origins in other places other than Europe. So to answer this, Hirsch points out an example of the Black Panthers, reading through Black Panthers publications from the 1960s. And now the Black Panthers are a are and were a very progressive organization. They would not consider themselves to be conservative. However, he points out how much knowledge they have of Western culture and history. And I have also read this in other places. For example, the Frankfurt School. So they're critical theorists. How much of their publications, how many of their publications point out things from the past, oftentimes Eurocentric things, but to challenge some of those thoughts. So they know the things, but they're challenging them. So Hirsch is not wanting to indoctrinate folks one way or the other, but he wants everybody to have the information so that they can form their own opinions, educated opinions, and express them well. I also read a book recently about Toni Morrison's work and how much more richly we can experience it if we understand the references that she is making to the past in there. Even to like Greek mythology and things like that. So he would not believe that knowledge is racist. He thinks everybody should have access to it and use it to inform their own opinions and be able to express those and know what the people in power know. And then another misconception would be that different students should be taught different knowledge. He is going to say that everybody should be taught the same thing. He also explains that this needs to be done mainly in grades K to 5. Criticisms of Hirsch are many, but some are completely unfair, but some may be fair. One that people say is that, well, society hasn't collapsed yet. Cultural literacy was written in 1987. He was already talking about young adults not having this knowledge. I was a kid back then. You know, we've all grown up without all of the knowledge that he would like us to have. And society hasn't collapsed yet. And he would say, yes, maybe things have not collapsed for you because you are somebody who has enough knowledge to be in a good situation. But there are those who were denied the opportunity to learn these things who have had a hard time of it. Another criticism is that his approach has the teachers being too much sage on the stage and not guide on the side, and that he assumes that the students have more to learn from the teachers than the teachers to have to learn from the students. That was a criticism I read in Rethinking Schools, and that one is fair. That one is fair. He does believe that. He does believe that the teachers should be sharing knowledge with the students instead of the students constructing their own knowledge. So I'm going to go through book by book and pull out some quotes. Some of the books I have no quotes from because he says the same thing over and over again, but just presenting more information, more data, up to date data as he goes through. He has some books that are more globally about education in America and some that are specifically about knowledge building. So his first book was on this topic was Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know. And this was written in 1987. And a lot of things happened that a couple that I mentioned before. Well, when this book came out, but another thing that had happened is there at the end there's an appendix, what literate Americans know, and it was a few things happened with that. It was hotly debated what should or should not have been in there, things that were in there that shouldn't be in there, and especially things that had been omitted that should be in there. And then the other thing was that that's what people read, and it became more like a trivia or how many of these things do you know, and not really looking at the content of his arguments in the book Cultural Literacy. But these books are still available now, so you can go back and see what they have to say. Some quotes that I pulled out of Cultural Literacy. Page 7. Many young people strikingly lack the information that writers of American books and newspapers have traditionally taken for granted among their readers from all generations. For reasons explained in this book, our children's lack of intergenerational information is a serious problem for the nation. The decline of literacy and the decline of shared knowledge are closely related, interdependent facts. And then he talks about the fact that you don't need to know like extreme specifics about all of the things that are shared cultural knowledge. You just need to know in general, like vague information about them. He also talks, by the way, about how it changes. So his lists have changed over the years. And so for one example, he says, okay, we no longer all need to know about John Jay, but we all now need to know about Rosa Parks. We don't need to know her entire biography, but we need to know, what she was well known for. So that he would say that the cultural knowledge changes over time. And also that it's vague, page 14. But even if their school child knowledge had become vague with the passage of time, it was still functional because the information essential to literacy is rarely detailed and precise. That would be something that would be different too, especially with this neoclassical movement with the trivium as stages. I do have a presentation, by the way, called What is Classical Education, if you're interested in that. So pages 23 to 24, I'm going to read from. Radicalism in politics, but conservatism in literate knowledge and spelling. To be a conservative in the means of communication is the road to effectiveness in modern life in whatever direction one wishes to be effective. To withhold traditional culture from the school curriculum and therefore from students in the name of progressive ideas is in fact an unprogressive action that helps preserve the political and economic status quo. Middle-class children acquire mainstream literate culture by daily encounters with other literate persons. But less privileged children are denied consistent interchanges with literate persons and fail to receive this information in school. And here, just as an aside, he's talking about that those who are less privileged would have less access to adults who have the cultural literacy of power. The most straightforward antidote to their deprivation is to make the essential information more readily available inside the schools. Providing our children with traditional information by no means indoctrinates them in a conservative point of view. Conservatives who wish to preserve traditional values will find that these are not necessarily inculcated by a traditional education, which can in fact be subversive of the status quo. As a child of 11, I turned against the conservative views of my family and the Southern community in which I grew up, precisely because I had been given a traditional education and was therefore literate enough to read Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, an epoch-making book in my life. So again, he's not trying to indoctrinate anybody in political conservatism or progressivism. He just wants everybody to have this information so that they can have and express informed opinions. Pages 103 to 104. What counts in the sphere of public discourse is simply being able to use the language of culture in order to communicate any point of view effectively. So as an aside, that's why I titled my presentation, Knowledge is for Everybody. Conservatives, liberals, anybody in between, or folks who don't want to talk about politics at all. It's for everybody. We should all have this knowledge. He goes on, after saying that what counts in the sphere of public discourse is simply being able to use the language of culture in order to communicate any point of view effectively. Some have objected that to publish the contents of our national vocabulary would have the effect of promoting the culture of the dominant class at the expense of minority cultures. But historically, the publication of vocabularies and dictionaries has not fixed the vocabulary of any national language, nor does the national vocabulary reflect a coherent culture of a dominant class or other group in the same way that a local dialect does. It is primarily an instrument of communication among diverse cultures rather than a cultural or class instrument in its own right. In fact, one of the main uses of a national vocabulary is to enable effective and harmonious exchange despite personal, cultural, and class differences. So knowledge is for everybody. Page 107, he says the specific contents of the different national vocabularies are far less important than the fact of their being shared. So again, it needs to be descriptive based on what is known by culturally illiterate folks. Page 111, as far as the failure of reading instruction and some of the achievement in our schools. The chief blame should fall on faulty theories promulgated in our schools of education and accepted by educational policymakers. And in some of his books that are more globally about education, he explains those theories, what has been out there and has stuck around and should not have, what has gone away but should have stuck around, those kinds of things. Page 113. To miss the opportunity of teaching young and older children the traditional materials of literate culture is a tragically wasteful mistake that deprives them of information they would continue to find useful in later life. The inevitable effect of this fundamental educational mistake has been a gradual disintegration of cultural memory, causing a gradual decline in our ability to communicate. The mistake has therefore been a chief cause of illiteracy, which is a subcategory of the inability to communicate. Pages 126 to 127. Americans in their teens and 20s who were brought up under individualistic theories are not less conventional than their predecessors, only less literate, less able to express their individuality. We should resist the extreme views of pragmatists and traditionalists alike. Those pragmatists who have based their doctrines upon scientific psychology are obliged to follow where psychology has led, which is back to common content. The anti-traditional goals of the progressive movement have turned out to depend upon traditional information. This paradox yields a middle ground for people of goodwill from both camps. It opens up the possibility of a compromise, a curriculum that is traditional in content, but diverse in its emphases, that is pluralistic in its materials and modes of teaching, but nonetheless provides our children with a common core of cultural information. 133. The polarization of educationists into facts people versus skills people has no basis in reason. Facts and skills are inseparable. There is no insurmountable reason why those who advocate the teaching of higher order skills and those who advocate the teaching of common traditional content should not join forces. No philosophical or practical barrier prevents them from doing so, and all who consider mature literacy to be a paramount aim of education will wish them to do so. And 136 to 137. I did think, by the way, that if I was going to make this as comprehensible as possible, that I should take each of the strands of what he's talking about and then pull it through each book. But I'm not writing a master's thesis here. I'm just trying to get information to parents, educators, community members in an efficient way. 136 to 137. Early in our project, my colleagues and I decided that our list should aim to represent, but not to alter, current literate American culture. The only exception to this principle that we have permitted is in the domain of scientific literacy. It is widely agreed that our shared knowledge of science and technology ought to be enhanced because of their growing importance in our lives. But beyond this small attempt to improve scientific literacy, we have tried to avoid any of the prescriptiveness that is inherent in cultural politics, the aims of which are fundamentally different from those of teaching literacy. A chief goal of cultural politics is to change the content and values of culture. But the principal aim of schooling is to promote literacy as an enabling competence. Although our public schools have a duty to teach widely accepted cultural values, they have a duty not to take political stands on matters that are subjects of continuing debate. Only a descriptive list accords with these fundamental goals of universal education. 139. Such a plan is not really radical or new. So a plan to have a curriculum that is systematic in knowledge building. In earlier days, when the school curriculum was based upon the materials set forth in Blair's rhetoric and the textbooks of his imitators, we had no need for self-conscious agreement about the extensive curriculum, because the common vocabulary of cultural literacy was explicitly provided in Blair's and similar books. Now, after many decades of skills-oriented textbooks, we must take a more deliberate approach to the problem of shared information. On page 144, to repudiate the idea of a shared extensive curriculum is necessarily to accept the idea of an unshared extensive curriculum, and that is precisely the extensive curriculum our schools now offer. So this was 1987, cultural literacy. And then after cultural literacy, he published The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. If you're going to read one of his books, this is the one that I recommend you read. And this is the one that I read first. I read this in 2021. And I did not write notes as I read it. I hope to return to it sometime, but this is what I wrote. I wish I had read this book when it was first published. A must read for educators. Keep an open mind. This author has written several other books, and I look forward to reading them all. And now I have read most of his books and all of his books on this topic. So it just really blew my mind to read through what he had to say there, because it really challenged a lot of what I had learned. And that was a more global book about education in America and the different theories and things. Then I read The Knowledge Deficit. So now we're talking more about knowledge building. He wrote a book called The Knowledge Deficit, Closing the Shocking Education Gap for American Children. And I read this concurrently with reading Natalie Wexler's book. And I'll talk more about Natalie Wexler later. But she read, Hirsch wrote The Knowledge Deficit, and Wexler wrote The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of Americans' Broken Education System and How to Fix It. And I looked at that and I thought, oh, what on earth? Like, is she coming up with something different? No, she cited Hirsch a lot. So she's kind of taking up the torch for what he has been talking about. If I can use a reference there, that is shared cultural knowledge, taking up the torch. Okay, The Making of Americans, Democracy in Our Schools then came out after that, and that was much more of a global education book and talking about the theories of education. And here are some notes I have on that. So there is in a chapter called Constructivism Bites the Intellectual Dust, in a section called The Wider Implications of the Whole Language Fiasco and the Effect on Disadvantaged Students, pages 96 to 100. Although most quality schools of education have finally conceded that the whole language approach must be abandoned and the explicit teaching of phonics adopted, they need to take the next step. Instead of seeing the failure to teach phonics as a small failure off in the corner, it must be seen as a typical example of the general failure of constructivism as a teaching and learning principle. And then he talks about that there is no inborn blueprint for a child's mental development. And then he says Piaget's stages assumed that anything that seemed hard and artificial for the young child, explicit phonics, for instance, was deemed wrong, harmful, and developmentally inappropriate. That phrase, developmentally appropriate practice, pronounced authoritatively, has been a dangerous hindrance to American excellence in early education. It advised withholding challenging material from young children that they might eagerly learn they had the preparatory knowledge to do so. Teachers and parents should therefore be wary of developmentally appropriate practice. It can stand in the way of progress for the child. Of course, readiness to learn is definitely a sound idea, but what a child is ready to learn largely depends on what she has already learned. The chief thing to keep reminding yourself of is that the child's mental development does not inherently follow the child's physical development. The body has a defined blueprint, the mind does not. The little French children in the preschool schoolyard look like the children over here, except that they're all speaking French. Their mental development in their very different culture clearly was different. Education is chiefly instructivism from the surrounding culture more than constructivism from within the soul of the child. So that was certainly something that was challenging to me, certainly in my undergraduate. The teachers were constructivists, and certainly in my master's program in educational psychology at UNLV, I had learned kind of the opposite of what he is saying. Over the course of the last few years, I've reconsidered things, especially looking at the data that he and others have presented. Now, here's something that is very important, very challenging to us, maybe causing cognitive dissonance more than maybe some of this other stuff. General thinking skills. For example, problem solving, critical and creative thinking, and general reading comprehension skills. This should say comprehension skills. For example, inferencing, finding the main idea, do not exist. All of these skills are domain specific and do not readily transfer from one domain to the next. So you are going to be a much better inferencer and creative thinker in something you know about than in something you do not know about. Dr. Dan Willingham has a lot of information about this in his books and articles as well. So he says, Hirsch says on 119, reading mastery is best gained by mastery of the words and shared knowledge of the culture. The same principle holds for science, math, the arts, and history. It is not enough to think like a historian or think like a scientist. In other words, we need to know information about history or science and the other domains. So he gives an example of long-term memory study that was done with experts in chess and those who do not know about chess. So they put the pieces of the chess game in a certain position, and those who knew a lot about chess, if the position that they put the chess pieces in, the researchers, was an actual play that could happen in chess, the people who knew a lot about chess were able to recreate that very easily, whereas the people who did not know a lot about chess were not able to recreate that. They had to kind of try to memorize where each of the pieces would go. And the chess players saw it as a play in a game, so it was very easy for them to put that back together. However, so then the inference could be made that people who are good at chess have really good long-term memory. However, when the researchers put the pieces on the chessboard in a random order that wouldn't really be a play in the game of chess, wouldn't be a way that they were organized during the playing of chess, then the chess experts did no better trying to recreate where the pieces went than those who were not familiar with chess. So that is an example of these higher order skills like long-term memory being domain specific. After the making of Americans, he went back to the knowledge building theme for why knowledge matters, rescuing our children from failed educational theories. And by this time, it is 2016 when this book is published. So he raises the question, why go to school past the 5th grade if every grade has the same standards? So now he had been very hopeful of a core curriculum. When Common Core State Standards came out, he was very disappointed because he wanted it to be knowledge building rather than skills, the same skills over and over. So for example, kindergarten, identify the main idea. 1st grade, identify the main idea. 5th grade, identify the main idea. And so he says, okay, we can probably get the main idea. So why are we going to school? And he says that it's because we need to be building knowledge systematically, grade by grade, especially in elementary school. And he says the long arc of knowledge, he talks about the long arc of knowledge acquisition, that this is not something that can just be done quickly. It needs to be done over the years. And that's why kids should be in school, to learn things, knowledge. On page 7, he talks about 3 basic ideas that depressed education in both nations, which would be France and the United States. So he presents data from these nations and like when they were doing well and when they were not and what had changed. Okay, and then he says the new policies that I and others recommend are based on a different set of ideas and emphases that are more consistent with current cognitive science, developmental psychology, and social science. Okay, idea 1. And I would say that most of us probably learned ideas 1, 2, and 3 to be absolute fact. So idea 1 that he says is a problem is this: early education should be appropriate to the child's age and nature as part of a natural development process. And Hirsch says early education should be chiefly communal, focused on gaining proficiency in the language and the conventions of the public sphere. Chiefly communal. And number 2, early education should be individualized as far as possible to follow the learning styles and interests of each developing student. And Hirsch's response is that every child in each locality should study basically the same early curriculum. 3, the unifying aim of education is to develop critical thinking and other general skills. And Hirsch's response, the unifying aim of early schooling is autonomy and equality of opportunity to impart to every child the enabling knowledge that is possessed by the most successful adults in the wider society. And Why Knowledge Matters, page 35. He says, teacher effectiveness is contextual. I have witnessed over and over that in a coherent school, most teachers can become highly effective. He points out on page 48, vocabulary size is the single most reliable correlate to reading ability. And this is something I just heard in a webinar with some experts yesterday, talking about the importance of vocabulary for reading comprehension. Now, here's something that was surprising to me. Now, most of us have heard, especially those of us who are educators, have heard of Isabel Beck's work and the tiers of vocabulary instruction. Tier 1 being the very basic words, tier 3 being like a really domain-specific word, like photosynthesis, and then domain 2 words being words that are more complicated than tier 1 words, but can be applied to various domains. And the idea there is that we should teach those tier 2 words because they can be applied to so many different domains. And Hirsch has a different thought, and he says we are going to build knowledge so well over the years that these tier 2 words are going to come up so many times naturally, the kids will learn them through the knowledge building. So we should actually be teaching explicitly. When we're doing explicit vocabulary instruction, we should actually be focusing on those tier 3 words. I'm going to read aloud from pages 66 to 68. Piaget himself became persuaded that readiness depends upon factors other than physical maturation. So talking here about Piaget's stages, and they usually have ages attached to them. And he says that is, Hirsch would say that they shouldn't have those ages attached to them. That even Piaget talked about that it's not just ages, or he became persuaded that readiness depends upon factors other than physical maturation, Hirsch says. Hirsch goes on, appropriate topics are determined less by the child's age than by what the child has already learned. And that knowledge tends to vary with social class and the degree to which children have been read aloud to. By kindergarten, what makes a topic inappropriate for children is not their stage of development, but the state of their relevant knowledge. Natural unfolding from within is not the critical factor for the cognitive appropriateness of topics in the school curriculum. What the child has already learned in school and at home is a critical factor. In light of the Bruner principle, teachers might consider abandoning the phrase developmentally inappropriate as a club to shame other teachers who are successfully teaching high-level topics to eager young students. Parents should be aware that developmentally inappropriate, he has that in quotes, is a scientifically suspect phrase whose only physical efficacy is to keep interesting knowledge from a child. To pretend that harm would somehow result is altogether baseless. First graders haven't been harmed by being exposed to the Pledge of Allegiance just because they don't yet quite understand it. The only important real-world effect of such sanctimonious bullying is to withhold from disadvantaged students high-level material that is widely known to advantaged ones. The entire idea of natural development as it is conceived by the post-romantic tradition in education is incorrect and must be vigorously rejected. It has been a cause of disadvantaged children not receiving a coherent, challenging curriculum. It has also been the cause of an unfortunate anti-verbalism and anti-intellectualism of post-1940 American education. Somehow the idea became accepted among theorists, again without scientific support, that the tactile and visual are more natural than the abstract and verbal. Even Dewey got caught up with what he considered the priority of the image for the child. He was wrong. Just as high a priority for the child and for humans in general is the word. By undervaluing what is verbal in books and lectures and whole class discussions, recent early education has scorned the assimilation of mere facts and the artificial stuffing of children's heads with accumulated wisdom. This has held back disadvantaged children differentially because advantaged children are being read aloud to and are hearing plenty of words, facts, and abstractions at home. Transmission, introducing your child to what successful people in the society know and convey to their own children at home, is especially scorned by theorists today as being culturally imperialistic, conservative, and illiberal. Transition of traditional knowledge is said to be conformist and suppressive of individuality. This anti-transmission doctrine is probably the most astonishingly misguided principle yet devised under the natural development conception. Transmission, far from being in conflict with human development, is essential to it. And in a democracy where each meets each on an equal footing, initiation into the shared knowledge of the standard language alone can make the ideal of equal opportunity a reality. By not properly taking communal knowledge into full account, the developmental tradition in schooling commits a basic developmental error. Human mental development does not slavishly follow physiological development. In all societies, shared knowledge is the elephant in the room. In modern societies, many citizens must be at home in at least two traditions. The universality of initiation into the group is the decisive refutation of education as quote unquote natural development. Or to put the matter more precisely, romantic educators have misunderstood the principle of natural development. Nothing is more universal and natural than the explicit transmission of communal knowledge. Page 103, he says the Common Core language arts standards emphasize skills such as finding the main idea, managing complex texts, and reading closely. Yet real improvement in students' verbal abilities will not depend on practicing these skills. It will depend on how much students know and how big their vocabularies are. He also points out something about the process model of like, oh, find the main idea and working on those kinds of processes instead of on knowledge is that sometimes it's harder than we think to find the main idea. And it's not always something that excuse me, can be identified readily, such as he says, what is the main idea of the Pledge of Allegiance? After that book, he wrote How to Educate a Citizen, the Power of Shared Knowledge to Unify a Nation. So again, just kind of putting everything together that he had said in previous books with updated research. And that was his last book on the topic a couple of years ago. Here's some information about the group that he founded. Now, a lot of people just think that he just founded this group and he's just trying to make money. And anyway, if you read back, what he about, his visit to Virginia, to the college there and stuff like that, you get the idea of how or why he is doing this. And a lot of the stuff is available for free. If you go to the Core Knowledge Foundation page, you can get free curriculum in various subjects. You just have to print it out. So that is available. And I will post this link underneath this video so you can just click through the slides and just click on the links if you'd like to. Okay, Core Knowledge has also published books, what your fill-in-the-blank grader needs to know. They have books from preschool to grade 6. My kids and I love these books. So I have now a 4th grader, a 3rd grader, and a 1st grader. And what we do is during the school year, once a week, and then more often in the summer, carve out time where we're just going to sit and cuddle, and I'm going to read aloud from their grade level book to them. And then when the youngest child is done with a book, then I read that aloud to everybody again. And you may think, oh, that's, too basic for the older kids. But I think it was like the 2nd grade book where my husband and I started to say, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. The books have information about history and geography and science. They have math in there. We don't use the math. We do something else for math. And then they have art and music and language arts and literature. And, they're like $20 or less, is what we bought them for. and they're not perfect. There's going to be something there that's not quite right or that you disagree with. There's just, but I don't know if there's anything better out there, honestly, that could be used for all students. So I feel like if each teacher read this as a read aloud in our nation, our kids would graduate with so much more knowledge than a lot of them have now. So, for example, the first grade teacher would reread the kindergarten one and first semester or whatever, and then read the first grade one. And the second grade teacher would reread the first grade one and read the second grade one. And there's just so much information in there. And it wouldn't take the whole semester. It's not that big, but I recommend those. I have really enjoyed learning along with my kids with those books. And then Amplify is a company that has published the core knowledge language arts curriculum as an adoptable curriculum for schools. And then they also have homeschool sets if you just need like a single copy of each of the books and stuff like that. So that is something you could look into as well. There are other knowledge building curricula as well as CKLA, but that is one of the bigger ones, and that is the one that was founded by E.D. Hirsch and his associates. So now Natalie Wexler is taking up the torch for the importance of building knowledge in order to have equal opportunity for everybody and for improving reading in our schools and in our nation. So she wrote the book, The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. And then she also wrote a book you may be more familiar with, The Writing Revolution, co-wrote that book. Now, down here, she has this podcast, and it's called Knowledge Matters, and it's really not that long. So I recommend listening to read the podcast. Yeah, good luck with that. Although sometimes they do have the articles with them. I recommend listening to this whole podcast, and she really wraps things up at the end. And it's very thought provoking. So after you're done listening to my presentation here, that's the next thing that I recommend you do. Just listen to this podcast, and it really kind of gives everything in an up-to-date and succinct way instead of having to read through 11 of E.D. Hirsch's books. And then there is a Facebook group, The Science of Reading Comprehension, Knowledge Matters. I have not had a chance to go through that stuff, but it is available there in that Facebook group. And then if you wanted to look at the kind of things that are taught over the years, you could look at the core knowledge sequence and then the Amplify scope and sequence for their CKLA, core knowledge language arts. So implications. Ooh. I mean, you could probably think of things that are like more macro and more micro, in your life. As far as my role as an educator, I'm kind of taking the easy way out because as a Title I reading teacher in my school, the way we have things set, I am working on foundational skills with kids. So I'm working on phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency. And when they get those things up to grade level, then they are exited from my program. Excuse me. I'm not really focused on vocabulary comprehension, knowledge building. So but I am interested in it as far as making sure that every young American has access to the cultural knowledge that the people in power have. I think it's very difficult for teachers right now to teach anything, especially in, for example, history, without being accused of having some kind of bias, one way or the other, even when we're just trying to get information out there that everybody needs to know. So I'm not really sure, what should be done moving forward. There's no way I think that we're going to have a national knowledge building curriculum. I know any kind of national curriculum, and when that's been tried in the past, Common Core, state standards, and before that, there was another one with National Social Studies standards that failed. I don't think that's going to fly. But then on the other hand, should we just have, a little bit of this, a little bit of that for different kids? What do you think? As a parent or as a teacher or as a community member listening to this presentation, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So if you would like to just post those in the comments, I'd very much appreciate it. It's something that I'm kind of thinking about right now, and would like to know your thoughts as well so that I can learn from you. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.